All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Renee Miller. I'm the program manager for the Oregon Bioscience Incubator, and I'm so glad to have you with us here today. Please welcome to this entrepreneurial education program on utilizing value assessments to determine clinical and cost effectiveness. At the bottom of your screen should be a chat icon, and please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you haven't done so already, so we know who's here. And during the presentation, if you have a question for our speakers, you can use the chat box to ask your questions, and they will do Q&A at the end of the presentation. So now, to get us started, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. OBI and Otradi would like to acknowledge the land we are all on, wherever we may be. Otradi conducts business throughout Portland and beyond, and is making an effort to acknowledge the history of the area and work towards decolonization of the bioscience industry. Portland rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who have made their homes along the Columbia River. So please join us in acknowledging the land we're all on throughout Portland and beyond. To learn more about Portland's native, diverse, and vibrant community, please read Leading with Tradition, a document created by the Portland Indian Leaders Roundtable, and there will be a link to it in the chat box. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have two speakers, Amy Miller and Sara van Geertruyden. Dr. Amy Miller is president of the PhRMA Foundation, and Sara serves as the executive director of the Partnership to Improve Patient Care, also known as PIPSI. If you have questions for our speakers, please type them in the chat box, and we will get to the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amy Miller. And Amy, feel free to take it away.
Thank you. I'd like to just thank those of you who have turned on your cameras. It is unsettling to me personally to speak to myself, a blank screen, or a bunch of names. Now, I do also understand that some of you are eating lunch since this is a lunch and learn, so I'm not offended. It just really helps to see people's faces reacting. So thank you, especially Alan, you're giving me some good face. My name is Amy Miller, and I am the president of the PhRMA Foundation. It is a nearly 60-year-old nonprofit that has been funding scientists for that entire history. It started by funding the field of toxicology by giving mid-career scientists at schools of veterinary medicine and medical schools funds to look at what therapeutics do inside bodies before going to clinical trials. We currently fund pre-doc, postdoc, and early career awards in drug delivery, drug discovery, translational medicine, health outcomes research, and in value assessment. So take a look at pharmafoundation.org for more details on our funding programs, and please apply if you are able to. I've been invited today to give a little overview of value assessment generally and what it means to patients, society, and you. When a drug is in development, I think all we see is the whiz, bang, cool science, or that it's a new therapeutic that's going to meet an unmet need, or it's an iteration of a therapeutic that's going to make lives better, or it's not going to have unintended consequences of taking the therapeutic, or it's a totally new type of therapy hitting a whole new group of illnesses. And we're excited. Patients are excited. Doctors want new tools in their toolbox. When it comes to market, though, things change. Things change quite dramatically. Being a therapeutic that's novel isn't enough. Meeting an unmet need isn't enough. Being the first on-label drug for a disease or condition where there's none is not enough, nor is it enough to drastically improve a patient's life. I'm sure you're surprised to hear that. You must accomplish all that, but you also have to do something else, which is prove value. What is value? Well, of course, that depends on who you ask. If you ask me, Or let's start with you. If you ask you, it could be that it's really cool science. It could be an innovative technology that right now is a vaccine for a global pandemic, but will soon be a vaccine for cancers or treatments to chronic virus infections. Or it could be that you're looking at a rare community and maybe your family has been touched by that rare condition and you're the one to do the breakthrough in it. That is incredibly exciting. And then think about the patient's perspective. Well, now I have a drug that's on label for my purposes, or instead of just treating the symptoms, this is going to prevent the disease, or it's going to prevent the disease's progression. Or if I'm treating the symptoms with off-label therapeutics, well, this one treats my disease symptoms specifically. And so I'm getting the treatment I need. Or if previously there was only an infusion and now there's an oral version of a therapeutic, that's great. From a patient's perspective, you are making it more convenient to me. Or maybe you're curing my pain, or maybe you're taking away the brain fog that prevents me from doing a great job at work. Or maybe you're taking away the aches and pains that prevent me from rolling around on the floor with your dog or child or full-grown person. That's all patient value. If you ask society, then society will say, well, society, need the airplanes in the sky. I need pilots and flight attendants and everybody who works at the airport doing their job. Because with migraine disorder, they're not going to be there. They're not going to be safe. They're not going to be effective. I simply need them in the sky. We can also look at that from an employer's perspective. I don't want Amy giving this presentation with half of her energy because she's got a disease that's not being treated. I want her all there. Here I am. When we look at FDA looks at your science and says, that's great, that's cool. I can't believe you've got this new way of treating a whole disease class. Or we've just been putting Band-Aids on symptoms and now you're treating the disease. Or you're tackling the specific symptoms that bother patients most. Good job. We'll even call you a breakthrough if you're for a rare disease. Really impressed, guys. This is fantastic. And then if you ask doctors, okay, now some doctors don't want to change their toolbox. They don't want your new tool. They're afraid of it. They don't understand it. They're used to A, they don't want B. But many doctors are excited about the new tools you bring to the toolbox. They think, wow, I've been treating things this way, and now I get to do something new, something different, or have all these patients that just don't respond to the tools in my toolbox, and now I get a new one. Fantastic. And so doctors value the therapeutic. Traditional value assessment, unfortunately, has not taken these perspectives in consideration. And as a community, as a broad community, innovators, patient organizations, academics, economists, we've all started to look at this and say, you know what, value assessors, we agree. We, as a broad community, agree that there are certain principles that should factor into value assessment. What are those? Let's look at diversity in patients. Men and women may differ on what's valuable to them. There may be race and ethnicity differences on what is valued to them. And some may be simply geographic. There could be rural and urban differences into what people prefer. We also need to look at the diversity of treatment options. So let's think of mood and non-small cell lung cancer, two of my favorites. So with mood, oh, well, I have to take this in the morning, that at night. We have to try this dose and then that dose and then the other dose. Why don't we just give them a GABA receptor that's orally available and boom, problem solved. That'd be great. That's not a thing yet, but I hope it to be a thing in a few years. Non-small cell lung cancer is the non-smokers' lung cancer, where a solid tumor is in the lung. And not too long ago, just about 8 years ago, maybe a little more, dating myself, like COVID time, subtract COVID time, and it was 8 years ago. We had a first breakthrough in a target for non-small cell lung cancer. So it went from chemo and radiation to a pill for a slice of that pie. That breakthrough led to another and another and another. And now about half the people with non-small cell lung cancer can get a targeted therapeutic targeted at their lung cancer. That means a few things. They get to live longer, healthier lives. And some people experience it more as a chronic disease than as a near death sentence in 2 years. That's exciting. But also the method of treatment. Now it's not chemo and radiation only. Some patients can benefit from an oral therapeutic. That is fantastic. I would much rather take a pill than have a shot in my arm or a drip in my arm. We also have to ask what matters to patients and society. And I used to be the CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research, and there is a lust for non-hormonal birth control that is not obvious, can be taken by a woman to control her own biology, that can be taken by women who are not yet 21, their bodies aren't fully developed, they don't want to take a hormonal product, but they are going to be sexually active. NGOs are asking for industry to develop it because they want to deliver it to women in need who really need to control their fertility, but otherwise can't. That is international society benefit, and we don't have it right now. And you may or may not be valued for bringing it to market. We also need to think about the burden of illness. We can think about it from our own perspectives. What's a burden when we're sick? We can't take kids to school, we miss soccer practice, forget to feed the dog, our spouse gets mad at us for being lazy because we're laying down all the time. But we also need to think of the burden of disease on society as a whole. Maybe we can't work, or maybe we can't give 100% at work. Or if we're a caregiver, then maybe we're caring for the very young or the very old. And so we may be sacrificing career advancement in order to take care of those responsibilities. And, we may be missing out on the genius of somebody in the lab coming up with these new therapeutics because of external circumstances where they have to give their best self to a caregiving situation. We also need to learn about or appreciate the limitations to current treatment options. So for example, there are some diseases that require medications on and off label to be taken at different times, different doses, or a combination of therapeutics throughout the day. That's compliance. That's also just being organized to have them with you when you need them. But wouldn't it be great if everything was combined into a time-release pill, take it once, and then you don't think about it all day? Again, not a thing, but maybe one day it will be. But will it be valued? We also need to think about value changes when disease progresses. So think about living with a chronic disease when you're 18, starting your life, going to college, trying to get your career sorted out, your personal life on a direction you enjoy. Then think about your fertile years and maybe treating the illness you're living with changes while you're trying to create your family. And maybe then once you're done creating your family, you are more able or curious about or interested in taking some options that you wouldn't have considered 10 years before or 20 years before. Similarly, we have to think about disease progression, and what works for your 25-year-old body may not work really well in your 45-year-old body. 45-year-old bodies are just annoying anyway. But if you've got that rare disease and it's been building on itself, then there's some factors there that need to be considered. And so one option that worked then, we can go back to migraine disorder, may not work 20 years later. And you need some new tools. We also need to think about real-world evidence in a post-market environment. When many therapeutics come to market, we have limited data on what they do, who they do it for, and how it works. But once a therapeutic is on market for longer, we have more real-world data. We have more patients saying, this is great. We have people not using so much health system resources because things are under control. That's hard to find in a clinical setting, in a clinical trial setting, but we can really see amazing differences 5 years down the line. And so as a therapeutic proves its value to patients, society, doctors, and others, we need to look at that as well. And you may wonder, well, that's a pretty darn good list, Amy, where'd you get it? It's simple. We talked to patients and just said, what matters to you? Then we talked to caregivers. You're taking care of a very young person and a very old person. What matters to you? Then we talked to employers and employers are pretty darn simple. They just want their employees employed and working at full capacity. And so they're interested in whatever gets us there. And so then it turns to stakeholder engagement and back to you. In the end, you don't get to say what the value of your medicine is. I don't get to say what the value of your medicine is. It's often up to health plans, public and private payers, and those who guide their decisions. Unfortunately, right now they use a pretty blunt tool, and I'll hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Sara, to give you a little bit of background on that. And she's also going to get into the fun part, which is the politics and policies behind value assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Amy and I've known each other a long time, and it's exciting that she's in this role. And, we've been unfortunately talking about this for too long. I'm coming at this. My name is Sara Geertruyden. I'm the executive director of a coalition called the Partnership to Improve Patient Care. And we are a coalition that is led by Tony Coelho. That may be a familiar name to some of you. He was a congressman from California many moons ago, but he was the original author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the reason is, that he's so engaged in these issues is because he's an epilepsy patient. So he comes to these issues with a lot of experience. His ministry is really this engagement piece that Amy was talking about. He will talk about nothing about us without us, right? That we want to make sure that patients and people with disabilities are consistently at the table in these discussions about value, policy, research, et cetera. So it's exciting to be here. The coalition that I manage, PhRMA, was created back in 2008, 2009, when the hot debate on Capitol Hill was comparative effectiveness research. And it's interesting because value assessment, the debate we're having today, I think is very similar to the debate that was happening in 2008, 2009, around this issue of comparative effectiveness research. We knew that there was a problem with how research was being done. Patients didn't feel sufficiently engaged. And so they really fought for the creation of something that would conduct this kind of clinical effectiveness research, but without using that kind of information against patients. I'm going to just share with you on my screen. Here, let me get to my share screen because I am not always the most, there we go. It worked. I love it when technical things work. One of the big issues that we fought for in that early debate in 2008, 2009, when comparative effectiveness research and all that was happening, had to do with this issue called the quality adjusted life year. And for those of you who do these kinds of health economics related to the products that you're developing, or maybe you have people on staff who do these health economic kind of studies, the quality adjusted life year is a metric that the disability community has been fighting for 30 plus years. The reason is that the QALY, as you can see from this chart, if you look at over here, I like to point out this over here under 0. So death is 0, 1 is perfect health. The utilities that go into determining the value of a year in the life fall in this range, right? So right in the middle is multiple sclerosis. But then you have over here on the far left, ALS, right? The utility actually shows that living with ALS is a state worse than death, right? And you keep in mind that this information and these utility weights are based on surveys of typically general population surveys. So you're not surveying people who have these conditions. You're actually surveying the general population to say, how would you score your quality of life if you had all of these, symptoms, conditions, et cetera. And then they come up with these numbers. The value that's assigned to people with these conditions, though, so say you have multiple sclerosis, a year lived in the life of a person with multiple sclerosis is worth half of somebody who's living in optimal health. So you can imagine that from a value assessment perspective, a treatment for any of these conditions is therefore going to be less than treating a condition for which somebody can achieve optimal health, because that's the one, right? And the other thing that's really difficult about this metric is that, so the value is, okay, say you go from let's look at SMA for a moment. Say you go from 0.2 to a 0.4, right? There's a 0.2 incremental difference in your quality of life, according to this chart, with treatment. Well, to go from a 0.2 to a 0.4 is extremely meaningful for someone with SMA, but may not be valued as such. Whereas somebody going from, say, a 0.8 to a 1, yes, they're achieving the same incremental improvement, but that improvement is going to feel like a much bigger deal when you're going from 0.2 to 0.4. So from the disability community perspective, there's a lot of concern that these metrics do not do a good enough job. They don't understand, how people value their own lives. Number one, a person who is blind is not going to judge their own quality of life as somewhere less than somebody who is not blind, like this chart does, for instance. And the incremental improvement in quality of life. And I'm excited that Amy brought up the issue of caregiving. When you talk about quality of life, the things that people value in terms of outcomes they get from treatment are very seldom captured in this chart in terms of what the incremental improvement in quality of life is. Typical value assessments are very vague, right? They're looking for square pegs to fit in square holes to come up with a number, right? Whereas the way that people value, typically, like, and multiple sclerosis is actually a really good one, because if you look at the EQ5D that's used to inform these weights, they look at mild, moderate, and severe, right? Well, most people don't view their quality of life in mild, moderate, severe terms, right? It's good days and bad days. And what does it mean to have a good day? And a good day is a much more functional day, where they need less caregiving, where they're out with their friends. The measurement for that is just very poorly captured in these utilities. So anyway, so that's my rant on existing value assessment and why the disability community has for a long time fought these metrics. And not only have they fought these metrics, but they actually believe that these metrics are wholly discriminatory. So there's a long history here. And so I'm going to run through a little bit of this, and I hope that I'm not going to bore anyone, but it's a hot topic in terms of politics. And what's fascinating to me is that you're in Oregon, where this all started. So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, right? That provided a right to non-discrimination in healthcare, combined with Section 504, and there's a bunch of disability laws, but let's just stick with the ADA. 1990, ADA passes. 1992, Oregon submitted a waiver to HHS for its Medicaid program, where they were going to use this quality adjusted life year as the benchmark for how they were going to determine their prioritized list of services. Oregon's waiver is way further than anyone else's waiver in this country. Oregon's waiver creates a prioritized list of services, and if your service isn't on that list, you don't get it. Even for children, they're the only state in the nation that has an EPSDT waiver, which is going to come up. And it's something that I hope that you're all interested in, because this waiver is up for renewal this year and the advocates are on fire about it. They're going to be looking to bar the quality, so get ready. Then later in 2007, 2008, like I said, the hot topic on Capitol Hill became comparative effectiveness research. And it's interesting because you wouldn't think that would be controversial, right? But what happened was that you had members of Congress on the far right who said, look, we don't want this because we're afraid that when you do these comparisons of treatments and products, what you're going to end up doing is creating a dynamic where payers will say, okay, well, if 60% of the people do better on this and only 40% of the people do better on that, then payers will say, we're only going to cover this and not that. And so all of the people who actually fare better on the minority treatment won't get covered, right? that was the concern going into it. On the far left, you actually had kind of a different dynamic where members wanted to use both not just clinical effectiveness research, right, but cost effectiveness research, and they wanted it to inform Medicare coverage decisions. So the exciting part of it is that there was a compromise. The organization that I represent, PhRMA, was a big part of negotiating that compromise, where they created what's called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and PCORI was set up to do comparative clinical effectiveness research, not cost effectiveness research. And within their statute, there was actually a very explicit bar on using the quality adjusted life year. Not only can PCORI not use the QALY, but Medicare is not allowed to use the QALY for reimbursement. So I think the way it's phrased is reimbursement, coverage, and incentive programs, right? So think, step therapy, whatever. So that's what happened in Medicare, or in the Affordable Care Act in 2010 when PCORI was created. So that was exciting. I think everybody kind of thought that this was over, that the QALY was gone. Then comes in this organization called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. ICER is an organization based in Massachusetts, which does QALY-based value assessments, particularly of new drugs that are coming to market. So their thing is we're gonna look at this drug. They typically are looking at new drugs even before they've hit the market. They're looking at them while they're in the process of FDA approval, long before there's real world evidence and good data to really kind of think about value in a more patient-centered way. So here they are, they're doing these explicitly QALY-based assessments. In 2016, their work kind of caught on over at CMS and through the Innovation Center. Even though Medicare is barred from using the QALY, the Innovation Center has the ability to waive Medicare loss. And so the Innovation Center actually proposed in 2016 to use ICER studies as part of how they would cover and reimburse Part B drugs. The patient and disability community said, oh no, that's not going to do. They fought it very hard. It did not go forward. It was rescinded. But even with all of this, the use of QALYs is rising and not falling. And it's not actually very clear. I think the most troubling part of these value assessments is that it's actually not clear exactly how they're being used or where they're being used. We're learning more about how they're being used in Oregon because advocates have pushed very hard for more transparency on that front. But in most states, if you go and you look at, say, their P&T committees, their drug utilization review boards, their prescription drug affordability boards, it is actually not clear the evidence on which they're making decisions that then inform their preferred drug lists at the state level. And in many states, it has been uncovered that they are using ICER, and some more explicitly than others, but ICER studies are definitely being used. QALYs are being used despite all of the history there where policymakers have said, no, this is a metric that violates disability rights laws. So I would anticipate politically, you're going to hear this come up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end too. And the lack of transparency, I think, is a big deal just to keep in the back of your head. Since 2016 and 2018, another example is that CVS proposed to its employer clients a QALY-based benchmark for designing prescription drug benefits. Disability groups then fought back. We went in, we met with CVS. We said, hey, let's try to find a better way to do this. Ultimately, they did cease marketing that benefit, but it was an aha moment for all of us. Payers are using these studies in a very real and meaningful way when they do benefit design and coverage. Jump ahead then to 2020. Oklahoma was actually the first state to bar the use of the QALY altogether. It was a very proud moment. It took a lot of advocacy and effort from both sides of the aisle. This is actually a really interesting, strange bedfellows issue that brings people together. And so they accomplished a QALY ban in Oklahoma. And then I would actually point out that this year in Oregon, when Oregon passed its prescription drug affordability board, the advocates, Disability Rights Oregon, really led the charge, and they passed a QALY ban within that legislation. So now the board is not allowed to use this quality adjusted life year metric when they do value assessments. The other thing is that the disability advocates during the last campaign fought very hard to get language into the DNC platform that essentially says we don't approve of the use of quality adjusted life years in healthcare decision-making. But we're still seeing QALYs very explicitly used in states like New York and in Oregon. We know from a Kaiser survey that was done that 20 states responded that they do use ICER studies in making decisions about their preferred drug lists. We've tried to do some research on this to figure out where they're being used and how they're being used. And I'll tell you that most of those states, there's no transparency about it. There's nothing in their meeting minutes that, references exactly how they're making these decisions. And now that lack of transparency is driving efforts to legislatively bar the use of QALYs very explicitly, both at the state and federal level. The National Council on Disability, which is an independent federal agency that advises Congress and the administration on disability policy, has been very actively engaged in calling on Congress to insert an unambiguous ban on the use of QALYs in this bill that's being debated now in Congress, the reconciliation bill that has some provisions related to drug prices. We're obviously very much supportive of that. We're super excited too that they actually requested that a QALY ban not only extend to the drug pricing provisions, but to Medicaid, which would be nice to sort of be done with this issue once and for all. But I can't agree with Amy more. I mean, no patient is average. And I think the one thing we know is that different patients react differently to the same drug. From a value perspective, different patients also have different goals and preferences in terms of what they're seeking in their treatment. And what we really need is better data, right? We need to be all working together on the data, on making sure that patients and people with disabilities are at the table, and then using all of that better information and then engagement to develop better methods for measuring treatment values. It's tough to compete with the amount of funding that groups like ICER get to do these value assessments, but there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do better. There's the Innovation and Value Initiative. There's a group over at the University of Maryland called the PAVE Center. And now we've got PCORI involved too. So I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on to do better. And I just, because you're creating these great, wonderful new products. And I just would encourage you to maybe pay attention to what's going on and be part of that conversation. It's really going to be exciting, I think, over the next few years if we really catch fire with getting rid of the use of this QALY metric to then be part of better solutions and better value metrics. And I'm happy to answer any questions too. And thank you for having me, because this is, it's exciting to talk to I usually talk to an advocacy audience. So this is, I'm sure you're going to have harder questions.
Thank you for joining us today, Sara and Amy. We really appreciate it. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. The first question is from Doug Kawahara. And Doug, feel free to open your microphone. Doug says, actuarial sciences does not seem to incorporate many of these value parameters in their algorithms. Are there changes in the works for this field? And Doug, you can expand on your question if you'd like to open your mic.
Yeah, it's just a sense that so much of insurance things are based on actuarials, and yet they don't really measure a lot of these value propositions that you talk about in terms of what the return is on a particular therapeutic or something of that matter. Is it just because it's too difficult to incorporate that into algorithms, or is it that they just don't care about that because it's not a number?
I was just having this conversation yesterday, so I'll start. I think one of the challenges that we've had when you encounter both the academic side and the payer side, the people who are the numbers people, a lot of times they just don't trust the methods, right? I mean, so like think patient preference information. To do a patient preference study is actually, there's a lot of really rigorous methods for doing those kinds of studies now, right? I mean, it's not unknown how to do them. And yet it's very difficult to convince the payer community to use them. And I think that and that's why I think this methods issue is a really big deal. I mean, and that's sort of where I think you're going with this. We've got to convince the academic / payer community that the methods exist. They do need to be incorporated into their algorithms. I don't think that's impossible. I mean, granted, I'm not the researcher, but I do think that there are a lot of organizations, like I mentioned, that are trying to get to this place where they're creating usable information for those end users. But everybody just keeps coming back to quality is the gold standard because it's all they know. It's what they're taught. And I think that we really have a big cultural issue to overcome in that community.
So I think it can even go further back. For FDA purposes, patient-reported outcomes are often in an FDA application for some therapeutics. And I've heard from manufacturers that when they bring even a PCO to FDA, FDA is like, that's nice, and doesn't even take it into consideration when a therapeutic's coming to market. So here we have a measure that is quote unquote validated. Hate to use that word because academics challenge me on it. And FDA accepts the measure, yet doesn't use it. So then when we're valuing the medicine, the quality is being used by traditional economists. So for 30 years, we've been using the same measure, and the economists then were purely quantitative economists, and they're still alive, well, breathing, and in Sara and my life, and they still talk the same way. When they say they look at patient preferences, I'm not even going to repeat some of the things they say because it's ridiculous and it isn't really about patient preferences. And so I think the quantitative mind has trouble with quantifying something that's qualitative. There is a new generation of scientists. I would say they started in graduate training maybe 20 years ago. So they're now mid-career. And I think they're getting to the point where we have to do it. It is not right to simply do the quality. It is a flawed measure. And we need to figure out how to quantify qualitative research. And the whole field of social psychology is 120 years old at this point. So I think they are losing that argument on the how can we do it question, because there's a whole field that does it. And so I like to look at the good news. So Sara's fighting the good fight. She's, fighting the power. I like to look optimistically at the researchers who are active now. And I see a lot of hope for our future. And at the foundation, we do fund these mid-career scientists and say, you've got to do it another way. We know you were trained the old way, but we're funding you to try new things. So please try new things. It's okay if they fail, but just do it.
Yeah, because another question if I can insert this other one, because I was trying to figure out how to say it, but it's interesting when you interview patients with a chronic disease and their physicians. It's interesting that they respond to questions already assuming a certain baseline of altered lifestyle, so that they've completely ignored the fact that they're no longer doing what would have been normal activity for them. And that's ignored. And then they talk about, say, side effect profiles or compliance based on everything beyond that point. And then if you take them back to the fact as well, if we use this new therapy, they no longer have to restrict themselves in this matter. And then they suddenly realize, so there's a lot of data that's collected that maybe they don't probe that. So you miss that. And you actually may be missing an entire value proposition for a new class of therapeutics or something along those lines that would make a huge difference in someone's life in terms of their being able to perform a job, or just for kids, being able to go out in the playground and play. Just happens I work on a pediatric rare disease, so it's in that context. But we noticed this in interviews with patients and physicians, that they tended to forget the fact that they've already taken out a great percentage of normal activity for these kids, and they just left that as a standard baseline, and you didn't worry about that.
That is a great point. And Sara, I'll start. Just a few years ago, as the president of the Society for Women's Health Research, and we did some education to patients to start with that. Start with what you can't do. Can you roll around on the floor with your toddler or your dog or your full-grown person? And if you can't, you have to say that. Are you taking days off in a week or in a month because of migraine or some other disabilities we're looking at? What can't you do that everybody else in the world can? And so you're making an excellent point, Douglas, that we need to talk about that. But we also, part of what Sara and I do is work with patient advocates to teach them how to advocate. And starting with your physician, just saying those things, I think it's extremely important. And looking at the flip side, I didn't go into, the generations of MDs still practicing, but there is absolutely a generational difference as well. When some physicians will start at that baseline, you can't do this because you have, but then you'll start at physicians, you can't right now do these things because you have. And that is not satisfactory to me. I work with a lot of R&D heads of major therapeutic companies, and they are so proud when they can hit that little kid who was never going to learn to walk. And now they've this treatment for this rare disease. And sure enough, they are 2 and walking like a 2-year-old, and they're proud. And so I think there's some education on both sides. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that's right on. I mean, the disability community is because I do get, well, I'll add this. I think there's a frustration in the disability community that there's such a focus on cures sometimes that these innovations that improve quality of life for a person who's going to be living with their disability for the rest of their life, right? It's a big deal. And so they don't really subscribe. People with disabilities don't tend to subscribe to this idea that treatments for incremental quality of life improvements are of lower value, because for a lot of them, they're of tremendous value.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. Thanks, Doug, for your question. We do have another question in the chat. Alex has asked, if QALYs are not patient-centered metrics, in what ways is it recommended for states or governments to make value decisions about what drugs to prefer? Because there are so many different diseases with different numbers of patients, different impacts on life. What ways are recommended to compare? And Alex, you can turn on your mic if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm like, as I think about, so I'm coming from a little bit the other side of the equation, where I work for IQVIA, which does a lot of the like pricing research and things like that, and like value assessments and like what can we recommend, right? And so but it's funny because patient-centered outcomes is a separate practice of our business that has been like massively growing over the last few years. So the advocacy is definitely working. But the question that we get from our clients is basically like, they need to get the drug approved, right? They need to get it through. And like at this point, it's those patient-centered outcomes are often disease specific, right? And so then as a government, you're faced with, or a state, or what, you're faced with the tough decision of like, do I pay for, like, I have a limited budget, right? Do I pay for this like ALS drug or this multiple sclerosis drug or this migraine drug because I can't pay for them all? And I think that's why the QALY has stuck, is because it's like the only way that people have agreed on so far that you can compare across different diseases. And I know, like you were alluding to that there are better ways. I'm just wondering if there's anything that's gaining traction. Are there any proposed methods? Like, I know incorporating patient-reported outcomes is part of it, but like, what's the new gold standard?
Before Sara gives a deep answer, I'm going to give a superficial one. We make choices in healthcare every day. And again, I spent many years working in the women's health field, where there are many different diseases and conditions that have 0 treatment options. Meanwhile, we have 7 distinct erectile dysfunction drugs that we do find a way to pay for, Alex.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying the priorities are in the right place now at all. Like, I'm not supporting the current method. I'm curious, what's the patient-centered way to do this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, going back to the QALY, I think, because the QALY is a tool for rationing, right? And I think that the challenge in this country is that we actually don't endorse rationing, right? I mean, that, at least from a broader policy perspective, you're never, we would argue that we don't ration care here. And but now Oregon arguably is because of the way that its waiver is constructed. But, so I guess I would say, if you look at if you look at things like multi-criteria decision analysis and some of these newer ways of doing things, there are other ways of looking at clinical effectiveness that are really focused on making sure you're getting the right care to the right patient at the right time, less focused on just sort of like a kind of a benchmark, this is the value and we're going to attribute that to everyone. But really looking at value in a more patient-centered sort of way. I think about, I don't know why this always comes back, it's an old example, but PCSK9s when they came out, right? There were a lot of people saying they weren't particularly valuable because if you look at a PCSK9 and the average, it didn't look great. But if you look at the PCSK9 for the targeted population that can't take a statin and is gonna, a statin is, I had a friend who was one of these patients. It took him a year to get his PCSK9 and he was in the hospital twice during that year because he almost died on a statin because his body just didn't tolerate it. And I kept saying to his wife, you really need a PCSK9, because I just, because I was watching this process happen in the value assessment, which is really sad, right? There are ways that we can accomplish the goal that we're trying to get to with making sure people get the right therapy at the right time. That's going to save a lot of money, and to do it in a more patient-centered way, right?
And to add what Sarah's saying, let's just take a health plan. The person who decides who gets a statin versus a newer therapeutic is one group of people, and they're on the 3rd floor. And the people who pay the hospital bills are on the 4th floor. And the people who pay for intensive care, cardio care, or end of life care, well, okay, those other ones are on 5. End of life care, they're on 6. And it's literally that reality that somebody valuing a therapeutic is not looking at how much fewer times a patient goes to the doctor. They are not looking at the mental health spend of a treated chronic disease. They're not comparing the PK9 to the hospital bills, which personally blows my mind that someone would rather pay, let's guess, $50,000 worth of hospitalization rather than a few $1,000s worth of a drug. So I think the answer is complicated because the bean counters, forgive me if you love one or are married to one or are one, they count different beans. And we need them all to put all their beans in one pot and then figure out how different slices, and it's not always a therapeutic sometimes. Like, so for mood disorder, we know exercise does. For mild depression, right. It lifts 50% of people out of mild depression, pay for the gym fees. And some plans are doing that. And so I do think that there are systematic changes that need to be made. Alan has been raising his hand old school style.
I'd like to add 3 things to this conversation. I can't agree with you more, Amy, in terms of the docs. As a practicing physician in the older group, there's definitely a difference. No question about it. I think that we have to get real regarding Sarah's comment. We do ration medications, we ration healthcare in toto every day. And to say we don't, that's ridiculous. Not only is it affordability, who do you get? What level of provider are you even remotely able to access is a whole nother story. The other piece that I think amplifies some of how do you do the evaluation is, when's the last time, and I'm using this rhetorically, so don't raise your hand or respond, when's the last time your physician actually did a QOL eval that you actually walked away going, 1, they really get me, 2, they can document this appropriately in their EHR, and 3, it's actually going to translate to something that translates to either a medication, a therapeutic, or some intervention that truly makes sense. Not unlike your statement, Amy, where you're right. If you had a motivated individual where we could pay for a gym membership and forget doing an SSRI, an SNRI, or whatever else, it's day and night. No question. The long-term impact on all levels is huge. And then the other piece, one more is how many physicians are going to be even smart enough, let alone tuned in enough to say, what are my real options? And I can think of a dozen patients who I've recently had that, here's as a good example, an ALS patient. His quality of life sucked. It just was awful. Would I want to put him on a medication, the one or two that are now approved? Oh, good God, no. What a waste of money, time, and energy. His passing happened in a very short period of time. And realistically, to have impacted negatively his last quality of life aspects, that's not being a good physician from my point of view. So I think this is a much more in-depth conversation. And unless we look at all those parameters, it just doesn't work. And one more, and the other stakeholder, what about the rest of the family members? When's the last time, and again, rhetorical, that you went to a physician who actually understood who you live with, what's their perception of what's going on, et cetera? There's no time, there's no allocation of funding for that type of input unless you go to someone who's a concierge physician and you're paying out of pocket. I rest my case.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent you're getting at shared decision-making, which is, I think about, in your example about and you hear this a lot in the cancer community, right? That people will, in some cases, people, from a shared decision-making perspective will say, I want that extra 3 months because of some event, right? Something that they're trying to get to. And then in some cases, it's a daughter or a son that's in the room that's pushing for treatment when the person really would prefer not to be on treatment. So I think, that there's a lot that needs to happen around shared decision making. I mean, I would point to the National Quality Forum a few years ago. Anyway, the Affordable Care Act actually created they were supposed to have this whole shared decision-making program that never got implemented, which is tragic. But the National Quality Forum did implement something where they created a roadmap. I would encourage you to read it. It's actually really good because what it does is it talks about why we didn't get to why shared decision-making just isn't there yet. And it's a lot of things, but a lot of it is just, it's clinician education. It's not having the right tools. But there are a lot of components to why we haven't gotten there yet. But I think it's something worth working towards, right? So that we make sure that we are delivering value to patients, that we're giving patients what's most valuable to them, which isn't always more treatment, to your point.
Well, thank you. This illustrates again what a complex topic this is, and that I liked the quote that I think Sara mentioned earlier. Tony Coelho said, "Talk nothing about us without us," which
nothing about us without us. That's
yeah,
the mantra of the disability community.
Yeah, bring everyone to the table. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to just wait a couple seconds to see if there's anyone who else wants to either open their mics to ask a question or put a question in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch a poll just asking for your feedback on this program. And I'll leave that up for about a minute. And please answer the poll if you would like to. We appreciate your input.
So I have to agree with Alan, because as soon as you talked about no rationing here, I said, well, controlling access is no different than rationing. So that is a problem here. And in terms of shared decision-making, I think part of the problem is a lot of those things should be discussed well ahead of time. Because even if you do make your decision, if you have a living will and those types of things where everyone's in a rational state of mind to say what they might or might not want, you still rehash it again, but at least you have some basis for a starting point. And I think that's where a lot of people put that off till it's too late to really have that discussion. Particularly in the case the patient may not be in a state of mind where they can actually actively participate, even though they really know what they want.
Thanks, Doug. Does anyone else have any comments? And I apologize, the poll doesn't seem to be working. So
it
never
popped
mind.
up for a moment and then disappeared.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a Zoom bug. It was just sitting there for me, but I don't know. I heard from others that it didn't work. So I apologize for that. Any other questions for our panelists before we close up for today? We really appreciate your input, information today. It's an interesting topic and one that's very timely, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in Oregon. I need to read up on this. Any other questions, let us know now. And otherwise, I will say thank you to Sara and Amy. Thank you to PhRMA for sponsoring this event and for Ramsey for putting it all together. We really appreciate it. Thank you to my colleague, Sara Vivian on the back end here who is helping out in the chat. And we hope that you have a great rest of your day. This program was recorded, so I will send it out to you in your email tomorrow. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.